Michael started talking about me calling him, and I got nervous he's going to talk about all the funny questions I used to ask him. He didn't get into that, so I told him myself. It's my pleasure to be here today, be able to be here through these lectures, and left Lorelai at home, and she's at home by herself, and I tell people that, and they say, "You left her there by herself?" And then I say, "She's 22," and they say, "No, she's not," because everybody remembers Lorelai being little, so she's at home, and I was very thankful to bring the other two with me. Very thankful for these lectures and the ones through the years that this congregation has put on, and thankful for Michael and the elders here and all those things. Last night we were sitting through the lecture, and I think that it was during Lee's lecture, and Makaria leaned over to me and said, "Dad, what's an antitype?" I've talked about it. I've talked about it on car rides at the house. She's heard David preach on it from the pulpit. And, this is just the way that our minds work, that especially as you're growing up, you hear things, and then one day it catches you, and you have to ask the question and go and see what it means. And so to introduce this is a type. Literally, this is a piece of type. And I think I picked this up in a junk store around Brownwood, Texas one time. They had a big box of them, and I grabbed this one. Said, "I'm going to get that, and I'm going to set it in my office, and when people come in and say, 'What's that for?' I'm going to tell them about types and antitypes." And I had that opportunity several times through the years, and this actually sits in my office now at a law firm, and I've had that conversation a couple of times there. But you might not be able to see this, but it's a number 7, except that it's backwards. You ink it up, and then you press it on the paper. This is the type, and what you get when you look at the paper that you can read, it's correct at that point, that's the antitype. That's the real thing that you're trying to get. That's what you want for the outcome. That's the antitype. Well, I got started reading about how media has changed things through the years a while back, and I ran across some statements about when presses were all the rage in Europe, and they were talking about a printer's assistant was called a printer's devil. There are a lot of stories as to why they are called that. One of them, which is probably not true, but it's the most interesting, is that they were called printer's devils because they could look at the type backwards and read it. So obviously witchcraft is involved with that, if you can read backwards. And that did become popular later, even though that might not have been the reason they were called that. In fact, Catholic apologists, ironically, used printing presses to print tracts condemning printing presses. Figure that one out. But they were called printer's devils. That's what they were called. There was more than one occasion where people said that the Lord had a devil because of the things that he was doing, called him Beelzebub and such things like that. And you can read about that in Matthew chapter 12 and Luke chapter 11. And later, in the same context as those chapters, they started asking for a sign, and the Lord told them that they wouldn't receive a sign except for the sign of Jonas. And then even later on in Luke's account, in Luke chapter 12, the next chapter over, he got on to them for their inability to discern things. He says, "You can look at the sky and you can figure out what the weather's going to be, but you can't look at me and figure out that I am the fulfillment of all these Old Testament prophecies." Well, that was their spiritual blindness. And they might have called people who made the correct connections, they may have called those people devils and gotten pretty upset about the fact that they were preaching Christ. They may have gotten upset about those things, but they were the ones in that same position because of their inability to see those things. The Apostle Paul wrote about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and he says there in verse 7, as he's comparing the covenants, he says, "But if the ministration of death written and engraven in stones was glorious," let me just pause here to say, the Old Testament was glorious. And sometimes I hear especially denominational preachers compare the covenants, and they act like the old covenant was just a horrible, disgusting, nasty thing. And it wasn't. It was a glorious thing. It was given by God, and it was good for the purpose that it was given. But he says here that it was glorious so that the children could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. And so he's talking about the fact that the law had built into it an end of itself. It was to be fulfilled in Christ. If you drop down to verse 12, he says, "Seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech." And sometimes I've heard this passage used to compare and contrast faithful preachers to denominational preachers, and I don't do that. And the reason is because what he's talking about here is in contrast to Moses. And Moses wasn't deceitful, and Moses wasn't preaching false doctrine. Moses was just under the old law, and the old law was a different revelation in terms of its fullness than the New Testament was. And he's dealing with those people who were just those people. You know, Brother Paul talked about their complaining. What would they have done if they looked at Moses' face? Moses, why is your face not shining anymore? Well, it's because this law, it's just temporary. It's what? You know, it's temporary. We're going to have to learn all of these commandments and build this tabernacle and figure out how to do all these complicated sacrifices, and then you're going to change it on us? What about the thing about the land? Is that going to be temporary too? You know, so you can imagine people with the attitude they have, you know, covering the fading of the glory might have been a good idea. And that's what Paul tells us, that veil that was over Moses' face accomplished. They couldn't see that because they would have contempt. And then he says in verse 14, but their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away, reading the Old Testament. And then he says that the veil is on their heart. They were unable to see that Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of all of these things because they have that veil on their heart. They were the ones who were spiritually blind. Well, if I can use the term, I would say that they would demonize anybody preaching Christ as the fulfillment of all of the law of Moses. And you can see that in one instance in Acts chapter 7. And how it is that Stephen was there preaching and he told them, you know, you've never obeyed the prophets. It's kind of funny, you know, they just run around saying, we love Moses, we love the prophets, and Stephen gets up and preaches and say, well, which one? You know, they're all dead. How did they get that way? You know, and they didn't die of old age. And so Stephen points that out to them, and it says in verse 54, when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed them with their teeth. And so they were upset about that. And you go up a few verses, and you see how it is that Stephen pointed out that Jesus Christ was the antitype, the fulfillment of the typology of Moses. And you pick up there in verse 35, and it says, this Moses whom they refused, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out. After that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, now watch it, he says, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me, him shall ye hear. And so there he's referring to that prophet that you read about in Deuteronomy chapter 18. And he points out that he would come from among the brethren. And he says, this is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us. And so, you know, he's telling you that Moses said there's going to be a fulfillment, that prophet, and I'm using that prophet as a term, that prophet, and he would come from among the brethren. Well, Stephen summarized the typology of Jesus Christ in this regard, referring to Deuteronomy 18, to point out both of them were going to be prophets, both of them were going to be rulers and judges, both of them were going to be miracle workers, and both of them were going to be deliverers. And we're going to look at those points as we continue on. Moses as a prophet was designated such by God, and Deuteronomy chapter 18 points that out. And you see there in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 16, the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire anymore, that I die not. And so the people were looking at these things and saying, we don't want to get close to that. You know, it was scary, the trembling and the mountain and all those things that they had experienced. They don't want to personally be subject to that. In verse 17, the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. That prophet that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 18 was like Moses, but he was different from Moses. This is the picture being painted of a final judge. This prophet was going to be different. This prophet was going to reveal all truth. In Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 10, towards the end of Moses' work, it says, there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And so even in terms of being a prophet, Moses was different. in that the Lord knew him face to face. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more, time permitting, but Christ is the antitype of these things. We already seen how it was that Christ was among them from Acts chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 16, it says, "There came fear on all, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God has visited his people." This is a reference to people thinking about Deuteronomy chapter 18 when they saw the Christ. In John chapter 1 and verse 25, when people came out to see John the Baptist, they were saying, "What are you doing here? You know, you're not the Christ, you're not Elias. We asked you if you were that prophet." That's a term, again. That prophet being the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18. And, John told them no. He's pointing them. He's the forerunner of the Christ, and he explained that. But they were already looking for that prophet, thinking that this is a category that needs to be filled in fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 18. That's what they were thinking about. And then later on in John chapter 6, after the feeding of the multitudes in the wilderness, they came out and they started making the connection. It says in verse 14, "Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, 'This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world.'" They said, "This is him." Now, to be fair, they were just angling for a free meal, and so it may have just been flattery, but they happened to be correct about it. You drop on down in verse 31, it says that our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, "He gave them bread from heaven to eat." And then Jesus turned around and pointed out, no, Moses didn't do that. God the Father did, and you missed that too. I just like to think about John chapter 6 and all those things that you can see there with the people's hearts and the truths that were revealed. But carrying on, in Acts chapter 3, verses 20 through 23, the Apostle Peter preached conclusively that Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, is that prophet that is referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 18. It says, "And he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things, whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed from among the people." He fulfilled that role, Jesus Christ did. He was from among them. And ironically, while they would look at this passage and they would say, that prophet's coming, we know what the outline of what it would take to fulfill the terms. We know what it is. And the fact that Jesus Christ was from among them was one of the very reasons that they would reject him. I don't know what people thought to expect. If he hadn't been a Hebrew, they would have rejected him for that. He was from the tribe of Judah, but yet when he was a commoner, they didn't like that. What is it they were expecting him to really be at that point in time? I kind of wonder about those people and what they expected to find. But Galatians 4:4 says that he was made under the law. He's one of them. He's under the law. He lived under the law. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 18 talks about Jesus in the flesh. And it says in verse 14, "For as much then as children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil." So we're talking about deliverance there again. In verse 15, "And delivered them through who fear of death were all lifetime subject to bondage," talking about bondage. Point that out, it becomes important. Verse 16, "For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren," which is one of the reasons that they rejected him. And then 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5 talks about him being the perfect mediator and refers to him as the man Jesus Christ. And so he was from among his brethren. Well, Jesus Christ being a prophet in fulfillment of the prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 18, what does this mean for us? You see this statement made every time that comes up, "Hear ye him." It's not enough just to academically say, yeah, I connected the dots and Jesus Christ fulfills those terms and therefore he's that prophet of Deuteronomy chapter 18. It's not enough just say, oh, I understand that. I'm going to write it in the margin of my Bible. Understanding it tells you, why were those Israelites fearful about going before God and receiving revelation? Why is it that the Israelites throughout the years, even though they didn't do what he said, that they had such a reverence for Moses? And why is it that when they were looking for the Christ, in whatever weird ways they were doing that, they had him in high regards? When we talk about those words, hear ye him, it becomes important. What was the job of a prophet? Michael did the lesson on prophets, did an excellent job talking about that. I think of two Bible verses that point out what the role of a prophet is. When you think about Balaam in Numbers chapter 22 and verse 38, even though he wasn't a good man and he did wrong things, he summed up what the role of a prophet ought to be when he said unto Balak, he says, have I now any power at all to say anything? The word that God putteth in my mouth, that shall I speak. People in our world today, they look at things, even if they have an untrained conscience, they get all fretty about things and they say, what should I do in this situation? And even though most of the time they might even be angling for, how am I going to get out of this with the least pain to myself? At some point they've come across what they consider a moral dilemma, whether it is or isn't, because they're ignorant about such things. But people, mankind is designed in such a way that they're going to come in those situations, they say, if I just knew what to do. And what if I said, I know what the will of heaven for you in this situation is? Would they listen? What if I said, yeah, I wrote it and I put it in an envelope, here it is, you open it up and read it. And then most people would say, I don't want to get a paper cut. They're all agonizing about these decisions that they make in their life and how they conduct themselves. But when you give them the opportunity to find out what the right choice to make in that is, they come up with reasons not to follow it. Another prophet, Micaiah, I like, in 1 Kings 22 and verse 14 said, as the Lord liveth, what the Lord saith unto me, that will I speak. The prophet is going to deliver you the will of God, which is why it is that we need to hear him. And when we talk about Moses as a prophet, when we talk about Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18 as that prophet, that's what we're talking about, in him being the one that we need to hear. When Jesus Christ, we heard one of the lessons talk about the Mount of Transfiguration. When Jesus went up there, you had Moses and you had Elijah. Jeremiah wasn't up there, but you had Moses. Jeremiah is a prophet and spoke the truth too, but he wasn't up there. But you had Moses and Elijah, and Peter gets all excited, and then, the voice comes out, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, hear ye him. You've got to listen to what he says, and you've got to implement the things that he says into your life. I think about Peter in Acts chapter 3, verse 22 and 23, and you kind of think about it. This was a big function, it was a big event where they were, and all those people around, and you kind of think about these people with buttons on their lapel that say, I love Moses, kind of like I like Ike or something like that, and these people were big fans of Moses. And you think about it in that context, and you think about what Peter actually said to those people when he was there and their mindset. And he says in verse 22 again, he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets, since the world began. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Now watch it, him shall ye hear in all things. You love Moses. Moses said there's another one coming and you need to listen to him. That's him. That's Jesus. They don't want to hear that. Did they really love Moses? Acts 7 verse 37, again talking about Stephen, basically said the same thing. Him shall you hear. Are you listening to Jesus Christ as you live your life? Are you thinking about the things that he says and say, I have to change this in my life because I am not doing it correctly? That's how it is that you understand Jesus as the fulfillment, the antitype to the typology of Moses. Do you study the Bible? If not, you don't like Moses and you don't care about Jesus Christ. Period. You can have the fancy Bible with the fancy binding. If you don't look at it and think about what's written in it, do you take it into your mind and read it? And then when you're driving down the road, think about, what does this mean in my life? When you do something and as you're driving away from that event, say, maybe I should have done that. And then you go back and make restitution, make the corrections. If you don't respect Jesus Christ as a prophet. You don't love typology. You don't love the Bible. And you don't love God. That's hard. That's simple, but it's hard. And when they came along and they're preaching about that prophet of Deuteronomy chapter 18, this is what they're saying when they say, hear ye him. Him shall ye hear. He's going to tell you what to do. And if you don't do it, you will suffer the consequences of being removed from fellowship with God and his people. Jesus Christ is that prophet. Moses as a ruler. I like to go back and think about him in Pharaoh's house. Think about how both he and Jesus renounced their royal estate to make those parallels. And I'm really excited about my fourth point, so I'm going to kind of skip over the next two a little bit, but there's some material in the book, but think about it. But you see that Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 10, and how it was that he was instructed in all the wisdom of Egypt in Acts chapter 7, and you see how it was that he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 25, and how it was that he renounced that. And if you've done any Bible study at all, you can't help but think about Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 and following. You ought to have the mind of Christ. What kind of mind? The mind that says that he's going to leave heaven, be here among men, and suffer even under the death of the cross. And so that's the mindset of Christ that we're supposed to have. And when you think about him as a ruler, you have to think about him also in that way. But they were both born into, or they were both rejected the royal estates that they were given in order to do service for God. But then you think about them in the wilderness, and I like to think about Moses out there tending the flocks in Exodus chapter 3, and you think about Jesus Christ in John chapter 10 talking about being the good shepherd, and you understand that has everything to do with leadership. When you see in Acts chapter 20, when Paul calls the elders of Ephesus, and he talks to them using that shepherd terminology to feed the flock. They were the shepherds. And so we're talking about being a leader. We're talking about being a judge. We're talking about leadership qualities when we're thinking about both men in that regard. But I like to think about that in terms of their character. What kind of character does it take for a man to stand before kings the way that these two men stood before kings? To go up before some of the most powerful leaders in all the world and to say the things that they said. You know, you can imagine if their palms were sweaty, if there was a rush of adrenaline during those periods. Hey, they were men. They were flesh and blood. They may have felt those things, but the important thing is they did it, and that's what character really is doing what you're supposed to do. And they stood up in front of those kings, and you see before that how Moses was considered great in the sight of the Egyptians, Exodus chapter 11 and verse 3, and you look at what he did before Pharaoh in Exodus 7:10 and Exodus chapter 8 and verse 1, and then again throughout chapter 10, saying, "You let my people go," delivering the word of God before Pharaoh. And both of these men escaped slaughters, and that would say something about how their character was shaped and thinking about who they were and where they came from. And Moses, the slaughter of the babies in Egypt by the decree of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1. And Christ in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16, which incident gave the opportunity for him to come up out of Egypt in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, linking the two men together. But Christ before kings is also interesting when you think about him before Herod. And you look at that in Luke chapter 22, and he's being interrogated by Herod and asked questions, and it says he answered him nothing. You ever sit there, you know what you think about something, and somebody starts asking you a question, they ask you another question, and you feel like you just have to start talking? If you're a human being, you felt that way. Now, if you don't grow past that and realize sometimes it's a good idea just to shut your mouth, then you lack maturity. But Christ stood there. He knew who he was. He had preached before other people. He had done his duty in order to teach the people who he was. If Herod wanted to know something, the evidence was there. He didn't need to answer anything, but that took courage. That took conviction. That took a character. And when something needed to be said, he said it. You read about him before Pilate on 2 occasions. On the second, when you read about Pilate saying to him that he has power to crucify him. And I like what the Lord responded. He said, "Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." John 19, verses 10 and 11. It takes courage to stand before a Roman ruler and say, "Now you don't really have that power you think you have." Isn't that cute? You think you have something. That takes courage. But both of these men were rulers and judges. They had leadership qualities that was intrinsic to their character. And it would do us well to develop that character in our own lives. Otherwise, we're not learning from the typology that's given to us, to follow them in that typology. But judging Israel, Moses in Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Both of these men were chosen by God. They were designated by their relationship with God as being special in terms of being rulers. And in Numbers 12, 6 through 8, he said, "Hear now my words, if there be a prophet among you, I the Lord will make myself known unto him in vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so." How is it that prophets got what their message, what it is they were supposed to preach? Well, God would deliver it to them in a vision, a dream, some sort of way like that. How did Moses get his? Not the same way. I told him to his face. And that's what God says, and that's how Moses is held up in high regard. And he says he was faithful in all mine house, verse 7. And you continue on, he says in verse 8, "With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall ye behold. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Going back to the previous point, talking about elders being set up as shepherds and thinking about the typology, Moses, Jesus Christ, and shepherds. This is a passage of Scripture I've used when I'm preaching on the eldership. Are you really not scared to be saying the thing against the elders that you're saying right now? You ought to be scared to say those things about the eldership. Sometimes elderships need to be spoken to directly. And when that's true, when you actually have to go to them and call them out on something they've done wrong, you still ought to be scared. That ought to be tremendously fearful to go and to do those things. But I think about that when I read this passage. But Exodus chapter 33, verses 17 through 23, and he says, talking about Moses, "I know thee by name." In verse 18, he said, "I beseech thee, show me thy glory." So Moses is asking God to see his glory. And y'all know how this account works out. And God says that I'm going to show you my goodness. Of course, he can't look at him in his face and behold the fullness of glory because Moses couldn't live through that. And God loved Moses and didn't want him, he needed him for further service and didn't want whatever it was that would happen to happen at that point, but he allowed him to look on his back parts, and that was a great honor. And Moses was to be esteemed for those things. But what I'm saying here is they were designated as rulers by their relationship with God that was different from any other prophet. And we ought to hold them in high regard as such. When you read about Jesus, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. There's a few different words that can be used to describe the witness. Witness is not a real word. That's not saying witness with a lisp either. I just made that up because it's talking about a quality of association. You know, those words that mean with that are alongside, words that mean with that are in the presence of, but this one pros means that they're to each other's face. And there's an equality involved in that, talked about in John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And you go on down, verse 14, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." I don't like it when people come along to this passage and they say, well, there wasn't grace and truth under the law of Moses. If God delivered the law of Moses to Moses, and He delivered it to people and said, this is the way you can escape your sins, and Moses was speaking what God delivered to him, and he said, God said this to me, I'm saying it to you, that would have been true. And if he said that you can have grace and these things are true, he would have been right about that. But if Jesus Christ didn't die on that cross, Moses would have been wrong about that. And so even if God delivered those things to him and Moses revealed them correctly to the people, they wouldn't have been saved from their sins, and those things wouldn't have been truth, because that would have made Moses a liar. If Jesus is not the Christ, Moses is a liar. And the people under the law of Moses who lived faithfully could have that grace given to them through Jesus Christ. And the truth that Moses preached about Jesus Christ was true because Jesus was the fulfillment of those things. I'm kind of reminded after I say that of something I read where one guy said, we have not time for such senseless tautologies. But sometimes you have to say things because people miss them. But he was the fulfillment of these things. Moses was a ruler and a judge in judging disputes with the people. Exodus chapter 18 and verse 3 shows that. And you know the role that he had in dealing with those people. And, you know, it's kind of like you just think, God bless him, in putting up with all those people said. That office continued on in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 23 when Jesus pointed out about the Pharisees sitting in Moses' seat. And he's telling them, if they tell you to do what Moses said to do, do it. But the idea of Moses as a judge is continued in that verse. And you see in John chapter 5, verses 45 through 47, the most important point in this regard is that a person's heart was judged by how they dealt with the law of Moses. It's just as simple as that. He says, how can ye believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one that accuseth you, even Moses, in whom ye trust. For had ye believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if ye believe not his writings, how shall ye believe my words? And so if they weren't going to do what Moses said to do, Moses had delivered to them judgments for their life, to make judgments on how they should conduct themselves. If they weren't going to do that, why would they do what Christ said to do? And the truth is they didn't love either one of them if they didn't do those things. Christ is a mediator. He's a lawgiver like Moses. And as such, he's a ruler and a judge also. That falls in that category. But a mediator is one that stands between two parties. And I want you to think about this. Moses didn't stand, he did, but this is not the role that he played as a mediator in this regard. He didn't stand between Pharaoh and the people in mediating. He stood between God and the people. And same comes with Christ. Christ doesn't stand between us making a deal with Satan on our behalf. He stands as a mediator between us and God because of God's holiness and our sin. There's got to be something in between us. And that's his role as a mediator. But Galatians chapter 3, verses 19 through 20 says, wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now a mediator is not a mediator of one, but God is one. I'm going to skip over some of those passages, but it's kind of like just read the whole book of Hebrews and learn about a mediator and see what it means. But I've already mentioned Jesus Christ as a mediator in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. The man Jesus Christ could stand between us and God, our God who is holy. Tempted to keep going, but let's just move on. The application of this is fairly obvious, is that people talk about accepting the Lord Christ into your heart. Why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? That verse explains so much of the denominational world and its failures. You're not doing what he says. Don't call him Lord. He is a Lord, and you will do what he says, or you will face him in the judgment. Jesus Christ is a ruler and a judge. He's the perfect judge. In John 7:17, he says, if any man will to do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. In other words, if you determine to do what he says, then you can start making those discernments that you need to make to understand how to live your life. In verse 24, he continues on with the idea of judgment, talking about don't judge according to appearance, but judge the righteous judgment. We're called on to make distinctions, to make judgments in our life. And Jesus Christ directs us in doing those things. And by virtue of his direction, he is the judge, he is the ruler, he is the Lord of our lives in that way. Jesus Christ is a ruler and a judge. I like Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, a passage that I wish more people would think about in this world. It says, for when for the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need the one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. For everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. He says, but strong meat belongeth to them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Are you trying to discern good and evil? Have you practiced that? Have you equipped yourself to do that by exercise? And are you looking for the Word of God to give you direction in that endeavor? If not, you don't regard the Lord as a judge. You don't regard him as Lord. But past that, he's going to be perfect in being the judge. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, Paul writes, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether good or bad. We're going to stand before Jesus Christ in the judgment. And if you think you were going to be scared to go stand up before Moses because of what might happen, you ought to be terrified to think about standing before Christ in the judgment if you have not been in compliance with his word, doing what he says to do. Moses is a miracle worker. And I'm really going to have to skip a lot of things on this one. Not all prophets worked miracles. John 10:41, John the Baptist didn't, but they recognized he was a prophet. The things he said were true. A man could be identified in his office by the miracles that he did. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 12. The signs of an apostle have been wrought among you. They could be identified as apostles. Moses can be identified by the things that were peculiar to Moses. Talking about throwing down that staff and it turning into a serpent. Picking it up again turns back into a staff, and I think about Moses' faith when God said, pick up that snake. That took faith. When he put his hand in and it came out leprous and putting it back in again, that took a certain amount of faith. I'd be scared to pull it out and have leprosy on it. But then finally pouring out the water and having it turn to blood. And I think about Jesus Christ and His miracles. And think about how the comparison and contrast when Jesus turned the water into... My stopwatch says 34 minutes, so I'm just pointing that out. Turned into wine. Moses turned into blood, something which was undrinkable, and Jesus turned it into wine, being common grape juice, but that was something that was better. But I like this, thinking about these prophets and men in authority, and I tried to follow the water miracles, and I'm just going to list them for you. Moses parting the Red Sea. And I just throw this one in because it's a water miracle, and I already mentioned the others that Moses did, is that him bringing water out of the rock. Moses parting the Red Sea. And then when the people entered the land of Canaan, the ark went in at the direction of Joshua, marking him as the successor to Moses, and the water stood still, was divided. And then later on, when you had the prophet Elijah, everybody knew he was a prophet, but when Elisha took over, he smote the Jordan with the mantle, and the waters parted, and said, he's got some authority. Jesus Christ didn't part any waters. He just walked right over them. He's greater than all the prophets, even in regard with the miracles that He did. My final point, the one that I wanted to spend more time on before Michael advanced the clock on me, was that of Moses as a deliverer. And you all know the story, so I guess I can probably spare some time in elaborating on all those things. But just let me point out Exodus chapter 2 and Exodus chapter 3, and I want you to think about the utter despair of the Israelites. An unparalleled superpower in the world at the time, Egypt. What hope did they have? The Pharaoh had it out for them, and he was making their burden great. And those people were suffering a great many things, and their cry of affliction went up to God, and God heard it because He cared. And they thought, we don't really have any hope. How much hope do you think they had of Egypt getting conquered and them being liberated? If anybody came in conquering Egypt, likely they'd be killed too. What hope did they really have? Do you understand the despair that I'm trying to get you to understand in this? We're talking about the typology of Moses, the typology of Egypt, the typology of the Red Sea, the typology of that deliverance. We have to understand how they felt totally captivated by the bondage of Egypt. And people today, they don't look at Jesus Christ and salvation as being freed from total captivity to bondage. They think of it like a Band-Aid. They think, well, I better get me some Jesus Christ to put on that. I'm not joking around. I'm saying that's the people's mentality when they think about Jesus Christ. They don't think, I'm lost. I'm going to die in my sins. I'm going to go to hell for all eternity, and I deserve it. It's my own fault. I can't do anything to save myself. I can't take on Pharaoh and deliver myself out of these things. And Jesus Christ comes and says, there's going to be no compromise in this matter. I will set you free. Serve me. That's the way that Moses delivered those people from Egypt. He went and stood before Pharaoh and he said, you let my people go. And Moses tried to bargain. Moses said, let's come to the table. Let's have a negotiation. We don't negotiate with terrorists. I don't want to get started on politics, but what is our foreign policy today? We don't liberate anybody. We do this nation building, and I don't even know what that means. Moses didn't believe in any of that. You're wrong. You're oppressing God's people. You're standing against God, and you're going to suffer for it. And God will be glorified by the utter desolation which you will suffer in the end of these things. And you know how it is that they crossed the Red Sea, and by such, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, that they were baptized into Moses. They became the church in the wilderness, Stephen says in Acts chapter 7. Today we are the church of Christ. We are washed in the blood of the Lamb, and we only had the deliverance on the other side of those waters of baptism, whereby we contacted His blood, and our enemies are vanquished. Satan has no power of us as long as we walk in the light, as He is in the light. Thank you.
Geoff, that was a terrific job. He mentioned that some of the questions that he used to call me up about were a little off the wall. They were. But it was his digging into the Scriptures that caused those questions. Some of them I just sat there and listened, and I have no idea what you're talking about, but it made him a better student. And as you could tell by his lesson this morning, he does an excellent job in his studies.